We are live streaming. And then I will begin the webinar, which will start recording a few seconds.
Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for attending this webinar for this evening. We are delighted that you're here once again. Let me just check. Pause. Can you see the screen?
Yes, but your slides are small.
It's not in slideshow. Okay. Okay. Give me just one second. You can still see them?
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, thank you and welcome to this evening's presentation on ecological spirituality, one of the goals of the Laudato Si action platform. I'm going to turn this over to Paz so she can explain how the Spanish translation will work, and then we will come back and do a little bit more housekeeping before we begin.
Thanks, Dan. Greetings, everyone. I'm Paz Artaza-Regan, Program Manager at the Covenant. And the information we're going to share right now is for those attendees that wish to hear this in Spanish. Les doy la bienvenida a todos los participantes que hablan español. Esta es información para ustedes. Si está participando en este evento a través de la transmisión en vivo en YouTube, no tendrá acceso a la interpretación simultánea en español. La interpretación solo funciona si está participando a través de Zoom. Vamos a incluir la grabación de la interpretación en español con el correo electrónico que mandaremos en los próximos días. ¿Cómo escuchar la interpretación de idiomas? En los controles correspondientes a su reunión, haga abajo la línea abajo donde dice Interpretation, interpretación, haga clic. Entonces va a decir si quieren el audio en inglés o en español. Haga clic en español, Spanish. Si quiere también, esto es opcional, puede escuchar solamente el idioma interpretado. Haga clic en Mute Original, silenciar el audio original. Recuerde de que solamente esto funciona si está conectado con la computadora. Esto no funciona en el teléfono. Si necesitan más ayuda, manden un mensaje en la caja que dice QA, preguntas, respuestas. Si están en YouTube, puede mandar un mensaje a info@catholicclimatecovenant.org. Gracias. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you, Paz. A couple other housekeeping things before we get started. So this session is being recorded, and the link will be sent to the link to the recording will be sent to you in the next 1 or 2 days. If you are on the Zoom platform, please type your questions in the Q&A box. You'll find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you are watching this on live stream on the Covenant's YouTube channel, please email your questions to info@catholicclimatecovenant.org, and we'll take a look at those questions. If you know who the question is directed to, so one of our 3 panelists that I'll introduce in a minute, please add that information to your question. The chat is available to you to have conversations with others attending the session. It should not be used to submit questions, so try to use the Q&A box instead. And we request, of course, that you be civil and respectful in this in the chat room. You will not be able to save the chat, so just wanted to let you know about that. So as we begin, let us center ourselves and be in God's presence. And I chose for the opening prayer this evening one of my favorite poets and one of my favorite poems by one of my favorite poets, John O'Donohue. So let's take a moment to quiet ourselves, to give thanks for this beautiful day, for the opportunity to listen and learn and expand ourselves in our minds and our hearts. So this is, again, from John O'Donohue. The poem is called For a New Beginning. In out-of-the-way places of the heart, where your thoughts never think to wander, this beginning has been quietly forming, waiting until you were ready to emerge. For a long time, it has watched your desire, feeling the emptiness growing inside you, noticing how you willed yourself on, still unable to leave what you had outgrown. It watched you play with the seduction of safety and the gray promises that sameness whispered, heard the waves of turmoil rise and relent, wondered, would you always live like this? Then the delight, when your courage kindled and you stepped out onto new ground, your eyes young again with energy and dream, a path of plenitude opening before you. Though your destination is not yet clear, you can trust the promise of this opening. Unfurl yourself into the grace of beginning that is at one with your life's desire. Awaken your spirit to adventure. Hold nothing back, learning to find ease in risk. Soon you will be home in a new rhythm, for your soul senses the world that awaits you. Amen. So this is, again, an introduction to ecological spirituality. This is part of our biennial conference series that is co-sponsored with Creighton University and Catholic Climate Covenant to help equip and inspire Catholics to more deeply integrate Laudato Si and its creation care teachings into the U.S. Church. Tonight, we will focus on eco-spirituality. So friends, we must be more than the Sierra Club at prayer. We are first people of faith, and we need grounding and nourishment for the long journey that is ahead. Buffeted by terrible news of climate impacts, strange and deadly weather across the globe, we must find both vision and comfort through our spiritual tradition. Tonight, we will explore some ideas about that, and we will have the perfect panel to help us out. But before we get to that, let me remind you again that this is the last of a three-part series on integrating Laudato Si into the fabric of the Church. This year, we have focused on the Laudato Si Action Platform to encourage a greater understanding of the platform and its 7 goals. Through this series, we hope to encourage Catholic individuals and groups to enroll in the platform, providing them with a clear path for accomplishing each of the goals. Catholic Climate Covenant has put together, is coordinating the Laudato Si Action Platform in the U.S. at the invitation of the Vatican and the U.S. bishops, and we've developed a website for this called godsplanet.org. And Creighton University is a signatory to the platform, so we are delighted by that. We invite you to visit this website, as you explore ways to engage with a Laudato Si Action Platform. All right, now the main event. Let me introduce the 3 presenters for this evening. I will ask them to share their thoughts one after the other, and then we can have a conversation with them at the end. Remember, use the Q&A function if you're on the Zoom platform, or send your questions to info@catholicclimatecovenant.org if you're on the YouTube channel. We will try to get as many questions in as we can before our time ends at half past the 2nd hour. So let me first introduce Sister Mary Beth Ingham. Years ago, I had the pleasure of attending a 2-week seminar at Mission Santa Barbara in Santa Barbara, California, on Franciscan spirituality. When planning for this presentation, Sister Mary Beth was the first person I thought of, as I was so captivated by her ability to distill the deep spirituality of St. Francis, Blessed John Duns Scotus, and St. Bonaventure. She has served as professor of philosophical theology at the Franciscan School of Theology, professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University, and president of the American Catholic Philosophical Society. Sister Ingham has written several books, including Rejoicing in the Works of the Lord, The Spirituality of Beauty, and Rejoicing in the Works of the Lord, Beauty in the Franciscan Tradition. She earned her PhD in philosophy from the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. Next, we will hear from Diana Marin. Diana serves as program manager for our young adult mobilization program at Catholic Climate Covenant. In this position, she coordinates the Common Home Corps and the Homemakers curriculum, a curriculum for ecological conversion for young adults. Diana came to this position having previously worked with the Nuns and Nuns, N-O-N-E-S, Land Justice Project, convening Catholic sisters and millennial nuns, again, N-O-N-E-S, in conversations on eco-theology and spirituality. Diana holds a Master of Divinity from Harvard Divinity School. Finally, Nicholas Kulura. Nicholas is a spiritual director and visiting retreat director at St. Raphaelia Center in Haverford, Pennsylvania. He's a board-certified chaplain. He directs a pastoral care team for a Catholic hospice organization in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. And he also co-coordinates Eco-Philly, a faith-based organization, a faith-based organizing initiative dedicated to creation care in the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. Nicholas earned his MDiv from Boston College School of Theology and is completing his Doctor of Ministry from Fordham University. So I will stop sharing my screen and turn this over to Sister Mary Beth.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Now I will share my screen. Can you see it, or am I okay?
Looks great. Yep.
Great. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone. As we consider the ecological crisis and the response we're called to make, it is helpful to identify the spiritual legacies within our own tradition and to see how these legacies and insights help us deepen and broaden our experience of this moment and our call to protect our common home. And for me, this is a Franciscan moment. Trying to advance my slide here. Okay, here we go. The moment we're in, as we know, is one of crisis. Our beautiful earth, a gift from a loving and gracious God, is in great, great danger. Wounded and broken, our earth needs our compassionate response. I believe that we are seeing a paradigm shift today that is bringing spiritual insights and spirituality to the forefront. More and more, the term discernment is emerging as a conceptual frame for action and reimagining going forward. Discernment is a spiritual term. It's not strategic planning, which, while sometimes necessary, does not take into account all of the spiritual resources at our disposal. So how does this shift reveal a Franciscan moment? In other words, how can we appreciate the insights of Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti from a perspective that informs their approach and insights? What difference might this moment make if we take seriously the Franciscan spiritual tradition that informs it. And for me, it's a difference that makes all the difference. We know that our present pontiff is deeply inspired by the vision of Francis of Assisi. He chooses to name two important encyclicals after the words found in the writings of the poor man of Assisi. Laudato Si, praised be to you, is taken from the well-known Canticle of Creatures. This canticle was composed by Francis shortly before his death, when blindness and suffering had taken over his life. In such a moment of pain, he sang praises to God. In this moment of global pain, can we not also sing and act in such a way that we praise God? Shortly after Laudato Si, Pope Francis published Fratelli Tutti. This encyclical, too, takes as its opening words those of Saint Francis. All my brothers. Building on the relational dimension of Laudato Si, this encyclical to the entire world calls forth awareness of our connectedness and commitment to one another. Using the parable of the Good Samaritan, Fratelli Tutti deepens the call to civic friendship and mutual solidarity in this global moment. So, how might the spiritual insights of the Franciscan tradition inform and support our own conversion and transformation, so that we might become even more deeply agents of change, artists of beauty, and life for our world? Admonition 5, seen here, is a cornerstone of Franciscan self-awareness, and it reminds us that we are endowed with great dignity, not just as imago Dei, the image of God, but as imago Christi, the image of Christ. For God has created us in the image of his beloved Son. What is more, the words "to be conscious" would be better translated, "be attentive, pay attention, nurture, attend to, care for." These words are interpersonal, relational words, not abstract words that ask us not to forget or keep in mind, but rather they're words of the mind and the heart. We are called to respond to the needs of the world and the poor in the manner of Christ Jesus. In my remarks today, I'd like to trace out briefly 3 elements of the Franciscan spiritual approach to the world: behold, consider, respond. These 3 imperatives call us to action, action informed by generous love. As we behold the world, we see it as a place of fragile beauty, a gift from the hand of our loving Creator. And we consider the dignity of each being and respond with generous love. For Franciscans, creation is not fallen, nor is it in need of us to fix it. Rather, it is gift, and we are called to care for it, to nurture it. Creation is part of our family, our interpersonal world of life, sensitivity, and love. No one who has a well-developed experience of the natural world can see it as objective or objectified and impersonal. Rather, reality around us in plants, animals, other people is alive and engaged with us in everything we do. It is the place for our conversion, our encounter with God. St. Bonaventure of Bagnoregio, in his classic text, The Mind's Journey into God, begins with an awareness of creation. He claims the beauty of things, too, if we but consider the diversity of lights, forms, and colors in elementary, inorganic, and organic bodies, as in heavenly bodies and in minerals, in stones and metals, and in plants and animals, clearly proclaims the three attributes of God: wisdom, power, and goodness. Therefore, whoever is not enlightened by such great splendor in created things is blind. Whoever remains unheedful of such great outcries is deaf. Whoever does not praise God in all these effects is dumb, meaning mute. Whoever does not turn to the first principle after so many signs is a fool. Bonaventure did not mince his words. Creation is a gift for us to care for. Gerard Manley Hopkins, a Jesuit poet deeply inspired by the Franciscan spiritual tradition, also celebrates the beauty of creation in much of his poetry. When we behold the world around us, we are struck by its beauty, and we can consider it more carefully, reflecting that each being, each and every being, is created with dignity, with value, and beauty, an inestimable worth, all because of divine love. Blessed John Duns Scotus explores and affirms this insight of the beauty of each being and the dignity of every being with a technical term, hexeitas, thisness. Every being, he states, is endowed with such deep dignity as a gift to the world from God. And like Bonaventure, Scotus affirms as well that the diversity of all beings demonstrates the creativity and the power of God. His conclusion is every being is just this. Take what it is in all its beauty. We might say every being is a pearl of great, great price. Finally, our steps of beholding and considering lead us to the act of responding. Our response is meant to be thoughtful and intentional, a way of bringing forth beauty in the world, a world broken and wounded by our own selfish actions. Pope Francis states in Laudato Si, "This sister, our earth, now cries out because of the harm we have inflicted on her by our irresponsible use and abuse of the goods with which God has endowed her. We have come to see ourselves as her lord and master, entitled to plunder her at will. The violence present in our hearts, wounded by sin, is also reflected in the symptoms of sickness evident in the soil, in the water, in the air, and all forms of life. This is why the earth herself, burdened and laid waste, is among the most abandoned and maltreated of our poor. She groans in travail. We have forgotten that we ourselves are dust of the earth. Our very bodies are made up of her elements. We breathe her air, and we receive life and refreshment from her waters. Francis goes on, I believe that Saint Francis is the example par excellence of care for the vulnerable and of an integral ecology lived out joyfully and authentically. He is the patron saint of all who study and work in the area of ecology. He is also much loved by non-Christians. He was particularly concerned for God's creation and for the poor and outcast. He loved and was deeply loved for his joy, his generous self-giving, his open-heartedness. He was a mystic and a pilgrim who lived in simplicity and in wonderful harmony with God, with others, with nature, and with himself. He shows us just how inseparable the bond is between concern for nature, justice for the poor, commitment to society, and interior peace. The urgent challenge for us to protect our common home includes a concern to bring the whole human family together to seek a sustainable and integral development, for we know that things can change. The Creator does not abandon us. He never forsakes his loving plan or repents of having created us. Humanity still has the ability to work together in building our common home. Here, I want to recognize, encourage, and thank all those striving in countless ways to guarantee the protection of the home which we share. Particular appreciation is owed to those who tirelessly seek to resolve the tragic effects of environmental degradation on the lives of the world's poorest. Young people demand change. They wonder how anyone can claim to be building a better future without thinking of the environmental crisis and the sufferings of the excluded. These are compelling words, and they ask us to reflect upon our own response and our own heart. So, how might we respond from within the Franciscan spiritual frame? John Duns Scotus here can help us understand how our heart and our actions are doubly motivated. Our heart refers to our deepest spiritual core, not our physical heart or even our emotions. For we possess within a deep yearning, a deep energy, a deep inclination for our own happiness, for our own wholeness, and our own perfection. This is a healthy regard for my good. But we also possess a higher energy and inclination for value, for justice, for things of intrinsic worth, independent of myself, for others, for the common good. Together, These two energies within us are activated in every choice, with the energy for the common good acting as a check on the energy for the personal good. We can restrain our use of the earth. We are social beings. We are called to interpersonal life, not just with others, but with all of creation. And so we are called to be like tightrope walkers, walking in the spirit, balancing our energies for self and other, finding inner harmony, and acting in beautiful ways. In our response to the world, we are responding to divine love and life, to our God who has gifted us with this beauty and asks that we care for the beauty around us and hand it on to the next generation. Our beautiful earth is like the stranger on the road, evoked in Fratelli Tutti, for whom the Good Samaritan stopped, overcoming his care for himself to respond generously with compassion to another who was in need. Can we not do likewise? So what difference does this Franciscan spiritual vision make for our response to the ecological demands of today? Well, I believe we can identify in this tradition a joy-filled vision of creation, a fabulous gift from the hand of God, a vision that is filled with joy and hope for each human person and every human action. It's an abundant vision of divine ongoing presence to us and with us. It's a deep affirmation of the gifts around us, a continuous call to go beyond ourselves, and an invitation to generous living. Pope Francis, in Laudato Si, has called us to look with wonder at our beautiful earth and to respond with compassion toward her, toward the poor, and toward one another. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary Beth. That was beautiful. And now turn to Diana.
Hi, everyone. My name is Diana Marin. I'm calling from San Francisco, California on Ohlone land. I spend a lot of my time thinking about the spiritual muscle needed to address this ecological moment. In my work at the Covenant, I accompany young adults engaging in faith-based climate action. And my spirituality has been shaped by youth who feel burdened by climate anxiety, by friends who are ridiculously in love with life, who are mystics and social justice rabble-rousers. My spirituality is also influenced by saints in our tradition who have taught me about integrity and boldness and tapping into Kairos time, and also by my mom, who instilled in me a sense that God is never far away and that God can also meet me outside of church walls. I feel grateful to be among fellow seekers tonight on the panel, on our Zoom call, and also among those watching the recording. To give you a sense of the shape of our time, we'll begin by discussing integral ecology, enter into the theological territory of remaining, and we'll create a new narrative together. If there's one thing to remember from this evening, it's that you are invited to remain in the complexity, uncertainty, and potential of this moment. In fact, we need you to. So with that, I'll share my screen and we'll get started. All right, so we'll begin with integral ecology. Pope Francis, his 2015 encyclical, which Sister Mary Beth framed for us, Laudato Si, emphasizes the concept of integral ecology as a means to understand and act upon the climate crisis. Everything is interconnected, and this invites us to develop the spirituality of that global solidarity, which flows from the mystery of the Trinity. Integral ecology frames life among a set of interconnected relationships, relationships between humans, and relationships that bridge human and the more than human world. Integral ecology is also a framework that calls us into deeper solidarity with those most impacted by ecological destruction. Pope Francis also writes, we are not faced with two separate crises, but one environmental and one social, but rather one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. So this is important to note. These crises are overlapping and complex. The social crisis influences the environmental and vice versa, and undoubtedly, there's also a spiritual crisis at play. So now the question is, how do we take this concept of integral ecology and allow it to fundamentally shift our worldview so as to respond to the call of this moment? So we'll enter into this theological territory of remaining, the spirituality of remaining, in the framework of integral ecology. The human situates herself beyond the individual through a broadened cosmology. So she finds kin among the more than human world and knows herself to be in deep relationship with all of life. She acts in solidarity with those people most impacted by the ecological crisis. And she also knows the ecological crisis to be a symptom of the larger, complex socio-environmental spiritual crisis. In a discussion I had with her on integral ecology, Sister Chris Laughlin of the Dominican Sisters of Peace remarked that we are in a cultural moment of collective transforming and of, in the spirit of Thomas Berry, reinventing the human at the species level, entering into the community of all life in the presence of a biological self that is merged through death and dying experiences of every biological form of life. This biological self, this remade human, is subject to continual iterations of death, as kin in the human and the more than human world suffer in the ecological crisis. This is a liminal space. It's a space between life and death. Physically alive, yes, but deeply aware of the death and destruction which surrounds us. Sister Nancy Schuck, a member of the Sister of St. Francis of Dubuque, Iowa, in her 2014 Leadership Conference of Women Religious keynote address, speaks of a middle space between life and death. Death, she says, is not an event that is concluded. Neither is life a victorious event that stands on the other side of death. There is a middle to this narrative. It reveals a theological territory of remaining. So stay with me here. As Christians, we know ourselves to be people of resurrection. We know that our death is certain, and we know that God is with us in our suffering. It can be easy for us to glorify death as both the final resting place and the impetus for victorious new life. But if we recognize death as an event that is not concluded and life as not a victory, then there can be a third middle space. This space between life and death is resurrection. It's the territory of remaining. As we increasingly see ourselves as interconnected and witness the ongoing loss of life and ways of living, a new narrative is emerging. This narrative invites us to redefine our humanity and to stay in the gray area between life and death. choosing to be awake to ecological destruction and to the very necessary changes in our day-to-day life those of us on this call will have to take. Choosing to be awake to the changes we need to collectively embody in order to respond to the climate crisis and its overlapping social crises. The narrative that is emerging will be formed by those of us willing to see humanity's interbeing with all of creation, and especially with one another, and by being present to the uncertainty, to the grief and loss of this moment. This narrative will be shaped by those of us willing to remain. So I invite you to create with me a new narrative. Let's be formed by the spirituality, uplifted in integral ecology, that we are deeply interconnected with all of life, with one another. Let us courageously witness the destruction caused by the overlapping environmental, social, and spiritual crises that we have allowed and that we have created. And let us usher in a new narrative that redefines the human. So we'll create this narrative by prayerful reflection of the middle space, the theological realm of remaining, the space of resurrection. And we enter into this space by becoming aware of our interrelation with all of life, past, present, and future, human and more than human. So with this, I invite you to settle into your seat if you're able to. I invite you to take on a meditative posture, maybe close your eyes and listen to your breathing. We'll be here for just a minute or two. Call in the beauty of creation, the moments when you have felt in communion with the living world. Place in your mind an image of that place, of that moment with creation. Where were you? What did you see, smell, hear? What did you feel? Notice the emotions that course through you. Feel them in your body. And breathe. In your next full breath, in. Let your inner landscape widen. Call in the climate of uncertainty and destruction of this current ecological moment. Remember the last time you read a headline of the latest climate catastrophe. Take note of people who are experiencing extreme weather. Perhaps people you know, perhaps you yourself. Call in the injustices associated with climate change, environmental racism, forced migration, biodiversity loss. Notice the emotions that course through you. Feel them in your body. What is it like to straddle both realities of ecological destruction and the beauty of creation, of injustice and of spirit's presence, of complicity and agency? Maybe it's bewildering, maybe angering, maybe peaceful. Remain here and breathe with me. The story we're collectively shaping that's happening on this Zoom call, on this conference series, happens when we stay in the reality of this ecological moment. In the realities that we have contributed to and shaped the climate crisis, It happens when we stay aware of a modern reality which emphasizes consumption over relationship. Our history in this country, in the US, which is founded with ideals of liberty, but capitalized off of enslavement and off of the genocide of Indigenous peoples. And in a faith tradition, which published doctrines that enabled the colonization of the Americas. This narrative we're creating can only happen when we stay in this space of recognizing the destruction, the pain, the shadow, which have enabled the climate crisis. And when we invite the awareness of our interrelation with all, our ability to empathize, recognize our contribution, and see ourselves in communion with it all. This practice embodies integral ecology by choosing to remain, staying with it all. We create a new narrative about what it means to be human, seeing ourselves interrelated with all, embodying that practice. As I end tonight, I want to share a dedication to a sister I briefly mentioned, Sister Chris Laughlin of the Dominican Sisters of Peace. Sister Chris shared with me the notion of a biological self, what I mentioned earlier, a self that has emerged through death and dying experiences of every biological form of life. She and I met briefly on a call over a year ago. We were both invited to be on an intergenerational pair, leading a workshop on integral ecology and communion. Unexpectedly, Sister Chris passed away before we could present together. But on that brief but powerful call, she defined communion as honoring the lives that have been given to fuel the stepping into the new. I honor Sister Chris's life. She continues to shape my thinking and my actions as I strive to embody a biological self and shape communities that honor the lives that have gone before. Sister Chris's most striking words to me were that not everyone will make it to the fullness of integral ecology. It's a challenging concept. It's hard for me to wrap my head around this one. But can you also accept this notion? What can it look like for you or for your community to move towards ecological justice, to move towards the creation of a new narrative without having everyone fully committed or understanding? What do you need in order to remain? I'll end revisiting Sister Nancy Schlepp's words. The promise of life ahead cannot always be envisioned. Death is not an event that is concluded, neither is life a victorious event that stands on the other side of death. There is a middle to this narrative. It reveals a theological territory of remaining, however long the night. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Diana. That was beautiful and amazing. Thank you for sharing your personal story as well. Great. Nicholas, let's turn to you and impart even more wisdom. So we look forward to your presentation as well.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. I love the meditative place that Diana brought us to. And so maybe we can remain there for a bit longer. And particularly with that last mention of Sister's life and teaching and death, if there's been a trajectory in my own spiritual life in recent months, it's been towards a belief that our ancestors are really with us. It's true of the saints as we name some of our ancestors in the Catholic tradition, those who are recognized as such and those who aren't. So maybe we can just remain a little bit longer in this spirit place, in this right brain kind of place of intuition, creativity, narrative, in the presence of our ancestors. I was thinking as we were kind of led to reflect on moments of connection with the natural world, that this kind of thing could be used every day as a kind of examen. If any of you are Jesuit educated or you're familiar with the examen, it was a method kind of taught by St. Ignatius and imparted by many generations of Jesuits since of looking back over the events of one's day and discerning both what happened, kind of playing back the events of that day, like a tape rewound and played again, and where was God? And I think we can kind of make that an ecological examen. If we just remember back, again, remaining in this kind of meditative place, just thinking back to the beginning of our day. I say this as night falls on the East Coast where I am right now. When we woke up and went through our morning, just briefly to remember what the morning was like. And what happened to us in the middle of the day. And how our day led us to this evening. It's just a brief examine, don't have a lot of time, but just to take a moment to kind of flip through hour by hour what our day was like. And the question that I would ask is, what was our connection to the rest of the natural world over the course of that day that we've just briefly looked at in review? St. Ignatius talks about the application of the senses, and Diana kind of brought us through this a little bit, going through what the Celts called the 5-stringed harp that we pray on. That's the human person with the 5 senses. So what did we see of the rest of the natural world today? What did we touch, hear, taste, smell? And just to notice, just to observe. It may be that mostly we were in contact with the built environment today, with concrete and asphalt and computer screens. It might be that I was out today, but probably wasn't having much of what I would identify as a spiritual experience because it was so hot and I was in the urban jungle today. But remembering what Sister Mary Beth shared about sometimes creation appears to us as a stranger by the side of the road. And did I stop and think about our planet and what's happening to it these days as I was out amid the oppressive heat? Did I have any kind of spiritual relationship with the rest of the natural world? And just to observe. You know, I use the term the rest of the natural world intentionally. And it takes a little bit of memory and intentionality for me to say that, because my instinct, as it is for so many of us, I think, is to say the natural world as though it were an object, as though it were other. And sometimes our built environment can give us that impression that we connect through our senses to the rest of the interconnected web of life so infrequently that it does come to seem other, that we aren't a part of it, it's out there. And so sometimes even the best of our eco-spirituality, despite our best intentions, can be reduced to, well, the natural world is something I go to every couple of weeks on a weekend when I have some time off and I can go on a hike. And if there's kind of a theme to my little thoughts, what I've been thinking about recently, it's the invitation not to consider eco-spirituality as simply a matter of going on a hike. what else does this built environment do sometimes? I'll say more about what it is, if not just going on a hike in a second. Pope Francis also has this kind of cryptic saying that he likes to use: time is greater than space. So without going into an analysis of exactly what he means by time is greater than space, just to observe that our built environment sometimes cuts us off from more than just forests and mountains and lakes. When we don't stand in the presence of the ancient, we can lose a sense of our own place in history, including even losing a sense of our own ancestry. Our ancestors, to whom dualistic division between us and the natural world would probably seem foreign, as it would to Jesus, who taught using parables drawn from the natural world all the time. And so sometimes when I do workshops, talks, retreats on eco-spirituality, I like to invite participants, as I'll invite us all to do now. We can think about what our ancestors' relationship to the natural world would have been. For some people, that evokes kind of a grandparent's farm that maybe didn't have even running water, but where we remember as kids experiencing the seasons. For some of us, it's having a sense of our religious ancestry, Franciscan, Celtic, whatever it may be. Kind of realizing that there is a spiritual thread that connects us to people who just had maybe a more intimate or conscious or aware relationship to the natural world than we have now. Time is greater than space. There's great wisdom that comes from kind of being able to draw on those roots, even as it can be disruptive of our kind of current way of doing things. I mean that in the sense that it's not only our built environment that can cut us off from our roots, it's also consumerist and capitalist practices that have us thinking just about finances and growth, kind of the prerogatives of the present moment, rather than on the fact that all who live must die, but that we're kind of in a tradition there of others who have gone before us in that process of life and death that Diana's friend spoke so beautifully to. I think that there's been a few great moments in the history of the church recently, just in the last few years, I would say, that connect us a little bit to a concept of eco-spirituality that goes beyond just taking a hike and being out every once in a while in the natural world, because it has to do with working on our anthropocentric, putting human beings at the center of everything, our anthropocentric tendency, and kind of cutting it down a little bit to size. First thing I'm thinking about is the Synod on the Amazon that happened a couple of years ago. Actually, an interest on the part of the Vatican in listening to people who live in deep and close connection to the land. There's a religious sister, Susan Smith, missionary sister of Our Lady of the Missionaries in New Zealand, who says, think about how the church conducts interreligious dialogue. So often it's Catholic dialogue with Islam, Catholic dialogue with Buddhism, all of which is great and important. But how often does the Catholic Church really dialogue with indigenous spiritual traditions? How often, I think there's a pastoral letter once, but how often do the North American bishops, for example, bishops in the US, really dialogue with indigenous people here in this country? Can we imagine someone from the Vatican not just going to sit with, the Archbishop of Canterbury or something, but with, let's say, a Shipibo shaman in Peru, whose central religious ritual is the ingestion of a psychedelic plant called ayahuasca? It's not as thinkable for me. There's a sense with our kind of Western rationalism that wants to look, even in its best sometimes, looks at the natural world as something to be protected, as though we're so superior to it, rather than as something to be learned from. The richness of its various metaphors, the many species that exist on this planet. So sometimes we have a tendency to look at certain spiritual paths and to say, well, that's a bit pagan. That's not really religion because it doesn't fit our sociological categories, and so it's not worth dialoguing. And maybe there's even something a little bit radical, disruptive about the idea that the earth provides us with what we need without the need for building cathedrals on it and so on. You know, and during the Synod on the Amazon, as probably many of you know, there are these statues of Pachamama, Quechua word from Mother Earth, essentially. I wouldn't pretend to understand all of the significances of Pachamama, but there were a few statues that were stored in a church of kind of a fertile woman representing Mother Earth, and some radical kind of far-right Catholics broke into the church and took the statues and threw them into the Tiber River in Rome. And on the one hand, you know, my immediate response to that is, oh, what intolerance, ignorance, you know, what a way to miss the point and show such disrespect. And, you know, that is how I feel about it. I don't think that'll be too controversial here. But, you know, what I think that gesture of the thefts and vandals kind of shows is that something was really threatened in them. That on the one hand, you know, we can draw on the resources of our own Catholic ancestry and live an eco-spiritual Catholicism. But on the other hand, this idea that, well, if we really opened ourselves up to something like the pagan, honestly, you know, to something that's so non-Western, it invites our spirituality and our theology to change. And if we've invested a lot of psychic energy in Roman-style Catholicism, that is going to be threatening. I look at just about everything from a Jungian perspective. Carl Jung, the psychologist, who says, for every identification that we invest energy in, there's a shadow. So if we really invest a lot of psychic energy in the rational Roman church, there's kind of an irrational, intuitive, less Roman, less hierarchical, less patriarchal shadow to that. And I think that comes into the picture a little bit with Pachamama. And these people just couldn't integrate it. Actually, it's a part of themselves. It's a part of their own spirit, because the opposite is just as much important to us as the thing we've identified with. But often we can't integrate it. It threatens the kind of distribution of power that we've placed psychically within ourselves. But they have to maintain some kind of relationship with it, and so they do it through hatred. Because hatred, and we can think about this with politics, with all sorts of things, when we really enjoy hating on our political enemies on social media or whatever it is, we're investing a lot of energy in that relationship with something that's actually a part of us, because we contain the whole, all of us. But often we can't see that integration. So on the one hand, intellectually, I think many of us might criticize, as I did, those people who broke in and took the statues of Pachamama. But just as we can have, you know, consider ourselves real protectors of the planet, but go through our day-to-day really without any kind of connection to the rest of the natural world outside of our built environment, I wonder, and this is kind of an invitation or a challenge, if we can't look within and see when we approach symbols, ideas, expressions of spirituality that seem a little wilder than what we're used to in our Roman context, that seem a little pagan, is there part of us that shies away? Whether because we really invested in staying in the good graces of the bishops and not being considered too pagan, or because these images of fertility that also speak of death that are very archetypal, that work on the irrational and symbolic layers of ourselves rather than the nicely controlled, rational dimensions of ourselves. Do we notice just a little bit of resistance? I think probably most of us do or have to, if we are as socialized into the Roman rational context and the capitalist neoliberal context as our examine probably has revealed that we are. So it's kind of an invitation in eco-spiritual terms to just notice that resistance and to try to integrate a little bit, to allow ourselves to be maybe a little bit pagan. I really believe that we can be Catholic and eco-spiritual at the same time. Like I said, when we look at forms of religious spirituality, especially many of them are those that live closer to the earth than we do. They talk about ancestry. And so even when we think about ancestors, it might seem pagan. Well, the connection I make between my tradition and theirs is through the communion of saints. So these kinds of lessons can transform our own religiosity, I would say, towards a more authentic version of itself, a version that's connected to even like the Franciscan tradition that Sister Mary Beth was talking about before the Enlightenment division between intuition and reason, or to other ancestral forms or to Jesus. But it will transform us. There is something radical to it. We will become a little bit more pagan, maybe. And just recognizing that that can be uncomfortable. This is an invitation to kind of look at our areas of resistance and to see, you know, how eager are we really to grow and transform ourselves spiritually, learning from the earth, learning from people who live close to the earth, rather than imagining ourselves as somehow these elevated, patronizing, just protectors of the earth, as though we really know what we're doing. Stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Wow, what a wonderful and lively, thought-provoking set of speakers we've had, and you've challenged us all to think a little deeper, to take some risks, to put ourselves in the universe as opposed to apart from the universe. We have a couple of really outstanding questions. But before we get to the outstanding ones, let me ask a couple. So in our modern society, we are often isolated from nature because we're so busy with family or school or work. We're hemmed in often by walls and screens. We're numb, I think. We've numbed ourselves so much that we fail to even notice nature, even when we're in it, never mind behold it, as Mary Beth said earlier. In developed countries like ours, it feels that we're at risk of not having a critical mass calling for change if so many of us have disassociated ourselves with nature. I think Diana hinted at this a little bit when she said that not everyone will make it to the fullness of integral ecology, living in that space between all this death and destruction and the hope and promise of a new humanity, one that is interrelated with all. So the question is, do you feel that there are too few of us embracing this new vision? If so, how might we overcome this phenomenon? So I'll let whoever wants to jump in on that question.
Well, I think I would say small efforts have enormous impact. And, you know, that you throw a stone into a pool and ripples and ripples and ripples and ripples. And, you know, the first conversion is always personal. It's my heart, it's my actions, it's my intentionality, it's my choosing to remain. So in some ways, I think that's an important question. And in other ways, I think it can be a distracting question because it sets it up in terms of success. You know, are we going to make it? Are we going to make it? Are we enough? Are there enough? And that's quantitative thinking. And I think what certainly Diana and Nicholas have invited us to is qualitative thinking. It's not a matter of how many, are we enough? What matters is my life. How am I? What am I doing? And And in my actions, am I giving witness to the conversion within my heart? And is that witness seen by others and affects others? I don't know. That's just my first response. I don't know, Nicholas and Diana, if you have anything to add or comment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you also mentioned in your presentation, Sister Mary Beth, about the paradigm shift that's taking place. And I think that is both one of consciousness, so an awareness of who and how we are and about our interrelation, as I mentioned, but also about our relationship among within the universe. But I think there's also a change in the narrative, in the wording of how we speak about ourselves, and about how we speak about our relationship to one another. I think as a culture, as a faith tradition, as we embrace more of that and create more of those dialogues, I think more opportunities open up for us to think differently about how we are in relationship to one another, and what success looks like, and to hold in that there is a complexity in this ecological crisis that is reflected on a spiritual dimension to our fracturing. So it's I think a complex way of saying that we have it will not be neatly tied in a bow, and we shouldn't expect that to be either. That this will be messy. Binaries will be broken down.
I'll just say briefly, I often say that if we're really looking evolutionarily, if we're looking at deep time, we as a species are really just crawling out of the mud. I mean, we're like new to the game here. And I'm actually pretty amazed that we do as well as we do sometimes, considering that, we're still figuring out how to overcome massive intergenerational trauma. I mean, we live in a very violent world. And we as a species, every generation carries the weight of what's come before it. And yeah, we lash out at one another, at ourselves, and at the planet, because we carry the weight of this trauma. And we haven't quite figured out, I think, how to grow and heal in a more healing way. I think slowly we're figuring it out. And I agree about this paradigm change. I was delighted when the Pope canonized Brother Charles de Foucault, who was a kind of missionary, but he really just went out to the North African desert and tried not to convert anyone, but just to be kind to people. So that's a paradigm shift from canonizing St. Francis Xavier, who baptized millions with the sweep of a hand, saying, okay, here's a more humble kind of model of what it looks like to walk alongside one another on this earth. So I'm hopeful for all those little moments that show that, okay, we're learning something slowly, but I don't really expect us to have it all figured out because we're so new. We're the new kids on the block here. And I just hope, I hope that there's enough of a paradigm shift that we can save ourselves and many other species from destruction.
Well, and if I can just add to that, I really appreciated your point about the toxic human behavior, that we're surrounded by such toxic human behavior. We often think that the ecological crisis is a matter of consumption. It's, can we just get electronic vehicles or electric vehicles? Can we just stop using fossil fuels? Can we just, we can solve this because it's a problem, and that's the way we like to think about it. But as you were speaking, what I thought about, the insight it provoked in me was, what if we really reframed, and maybe Diana, this is kind of where you're going, what if we really reframed what's happening on the eastern coast of this country and the South with the heat, not just as the result of the fact that we're using fossil fuels and we're depleting the resources, but the fact that we are introducing with our hatred so much toxic spiritual energy in that the planet is dying, not so much because we're over consuming, which we are, don't get me wrong, but in addition to our overconsumption, we are poisoning the spiritual shell that protects our earth. So if this doesn't get our attention, what's happening right now, and the timeliness of this series, I think, for what's happening right now, we really aren't paying attention. And I just think it's such a deep call for a transformation of heart and how we think about each other, how we talk to each other. And we think of what the Pope is doing with the Synod and all these efforts to talk across differences and listen to people that don't share my view of things. It's a dramatic call for a change of behavior, a change of thinking. It's either going to break down or it's going to break through. And I think there's just no, it's one or the other. And the choice is for each one of us in our lives. What can I do? What am I doing? And people I know and people I work with, people in my parish, people in my community, what can we do together to start building things? I really appreciated, Nicholas, your point about toxicity and Diana, your point about remaining and how hard it is to remain in this moment. We'd rather run right to life or death, get it over with. Can we just move on? But it's hold it. And it's the two energies, I think, in what I was talking about in the human heart. Can we hold that tension and not tip one way or the other? We live in such a binary world way of thinking. It's killing us. Yeah. It's killing us. It's killing our planet.
Yeah, thank you. I also was struck earlier by, particularly with you, Mary Beth, about this story of Saint Francis and how he wrote the Canticle of the Creatures when he was suffering terribly, nearly blind. It reminds me also of powerful insights from people like Saint John of the Cross or Julian of Norwich, who themselves face very serious physical and psychological trauma. And I wonder if and yet they left behind this spiritual treasure that and a witness for life in Christ. I think for them and many others, I find that that they have a deeper compassion and a more expansive heart going through such profound suffering than maybe those of us who haven't experienced that. And I guess I wonder if, as we all experience more and more suffering, destruction, death from the climate crisis, how might we allow that horror to transform us and to call us into deeper compassion, to expand our hearts rather than a response that I think a lot of us feel which is just to throw up our hands at best, or maybe sink into deep despair at worst. How do we, what's your thoughts about that, about suffering as a transformative impetus to do more? I don't know who wants to take that.
Well, I agree. I think, and in the life of Francis, he was very ill, and it was his suffering that softened his heart and caused him to see the wounded knight and give him his cloak and to reach out to the person. And so I think in each one of our lives, there is greater or lesser suffering. I think the question is not, do we suffer, but what do we do with our suffering? And does it promote a sense of solidarity with others? I mean, it's such a moment to reframe everything. And I think, Diane, I keep go back to we've got to come up with a new narrative here. It's not working for us.
Yeah.
And the young people are really seeing it's not working for us. And they're saying to us, it's not working for us. So we can either say they're wrong and throw up our hands, or, think it's, and you look at these movies and all these apocalyptic movies, right? So the images that are before us are so dire and so negative. And I'm not saying we need to celebrate those things, but is that our vision of how God is with us? Is that our vision? It's going to be destroyed, or there's going to be an apocalyptic moment and Jesus will return. And I think there are some who think, well, let's just go ahead and destroy the earth. It's really okay because Jesus is coming next week, and we'll all be ushered into the parousia. I don't know when Jesus is coming, and I don't know what God has in mind. I just know that God is suffering now with us. We are suffering. And the more we join together to turn our suffering into action for healing, relationships, attitudes toward the earth. And I think the integral ecology point, Anna, which I thought was so important in Laudato Si, is to see that all of this woundedness is connected, that the poor, the people who live in parts of cities who are being who are suffering. I mean, the people that are suffering for this are the innocent in some ways. They're not the ones who are responsible. I'm sure I haven't answered your question, but it's
that's fine. Yeah, and it struck me, if I can just interject here and step out of the role of facilitator for a minute, but Bob Moore, who's a dear friend of the Covenants, asked the question I think that you're answering, which is, what does God think about all of this? And one time I heard, and I can't remember who said this, but it was at a conference that I was at, who said that, God doesn't get angry with us. I think she said, I think God is disappointed. And when you look back at your childhood, you would much rather your parents yell at you than just say, oh, I am so disappointed in you. Because then you got to own that, and you got to say, oh, I really disappointed someone who loves me and someone who I love deeply. And so how do I, are ignoring this climate crisis? I think God is disappointed that we're not stepping up. And so I wonder if that's part of that answer too. But let me ask another question from another Moore, Mary Sharon Moore. The Moores are upon us here. She says, how can we bring Wall Street facing corporate leaders to behold, consider, and respond? That is, to undergo an ecological conversion. Are there any successes that can serve as a model and incentive? So that may be a little bit beyond our scope, but I'll let you take a crack at that. Any one of you.
Anna, were you going to say? It looked like you were going to. Okay.
Go ahead, Nicholas.
Yeah, I don't know. People are so complicated. I mean, there's some great, we hear about the CEO of Patagonia, for example, who's just very informed and so on about stuff like this, and trying to bring someone from 80 degrees in this direction, applying the brakes and going in the other direction. I'm not really sure. What comes to mind actually, and this is probably not answering the question, but even when we're talking about suffering, maybe the answer to the question is, it takes some suffering for CEOs to kind of, suffering defined as losing money and so on, and so converting enough stakeholders. But I was thinking about an anecdote in Naomi Klein's book. Was it Capitalism versus, I can't remember what it was called, one of Naomi Klein's books. And she talks about really a worker who was working probably in mines or something in Canada, or in oil. And then they kind of had a solar power, kind of a solar panel producing plant or something. And he got a job there. And for the first time, felt like his work was providing a future for his children and grandchildren. And that sense of pride in his work, that was his awakening. It wasn't really through suffering, but it was through an experience of work, on this kind of thing, through the lens of his own particular talents and training, that was ennobling.
Yeah.
It's not addressing CEOs, but I wonder if there's something there about just all of us collectively, including as workers, as consumers, because we are going to consume, really kind of bringing enough people. That's maybe the ripple effect that Sister Mary Beth was talking about, to really seeing the value in this kind of work, seeing that it can be sustainable, seeing that it can be profitable for families and communities and healthy. Eventually, I mean, a year or two ago, there was a letter that was signed by, I don't know, it was BlackRock or something, a bunch of investment firms and car companies. I'm sure someone on this call knows better than I do. I'm not remembering the details, but a bunch of these kinds of, CEO kind of people saying, yeah, climate change is real and we got to move towards a more sustainable, but I think that they're just like following the money.
Yeah, I want to give a shout out quickly to an organization called the Francesco Economy. They're doing a series of workshops. I attended one of those. It's a pretty intense and involved workshop. It's over a period of 3 or 4 weeks. It's called Livable Futures, and they're actually bringing in money managers and foundation, heads of foundations, and getting them to think differently about investments and about what they're supporting. About not just grants, but also, program related or mission related investing in organizations, supporting co-ops and those types of things. So there's something going on there as well. And that's a growing movement, inspired by the Francesco Economy movement that Pope Francis himself had sort of got moving. So anyway, I want to give a shout out to them. Diana, did you want to say something on that question before I jump to the next one?
Absolutely. I think I was going to say, folks won't be able to shift until we realize that we can't eat money, right? And I think CEOs, folks who are in power, whatever the institution is, it will come to that particular moment when, if the air is so polluted, if the land is no longer providing, if water is no longer available, what do we have left? And I think that will be the reckoning moment for many people to realize that we have to shift.
Yeah. There's a couple of, and this will be our last question, but there's a couple of questions around what can we learn from indigenous communities, native communities. Nicholas, I think you touched on some of this, but what are the lessons there that we could take with us as we journey forth?
Well, one point that I would raise that struck me both as Diana and Nicholas were speaking is, we use the word spiritual and we use it tonight. This is the spirituality of ecological justice. And so often in our minds, and here's the paradigm shift, so often in our minds, we juxtapose spiritual with material, or so that I think I'm a spiritual person because I don't have a lot of things. I'm a spiritual person because I can really have my spirit, I'm just so otherworldly. I'm just so, And I think what we can learn from the indigenous peoples is there's another way to understand what does it mean to be spiritual. And Nicholas, you referred to it. It's walking according to the spirit. And that's what I think indigenous peoples give witness to. They walk with the spirit in the world. And so for us to recognize the dualism of modernity and recognize how even our spiritual intuition sometimes can be dualistic, because we're not thinking about spirituality as walking in the spirit. We're thinking of spirituality as not material. So that's one insight I think that can help in the paradigm shift.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I'll add into just the importance of being in solidarity with Indigenous communities, and also recognizing the church's own role in causing harm to Indigenous communities, ongoing harm. And so I think we can't speak about Indigenous spirituality without also recognizing the ways in which the church has tampered upon, dampened, and caused violence to that, not only the spirituality, but to those peoples, to that culture, and naming how there too is also an incredible opportunity for the church to provide reckoning with and serve as an example of what being in deeper solidarity can look like, in naming what past harms happened and in moving through that. So there's also our own spiritual work as a Catholic community that needs to be done in order to be better in right relationship with Indigenous communities.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you all very much. I'm going to start to bring this to a close. So again, at the bottom of your screen, if you want to give some emojis, some claps, some bouquets to our speakers who, for Mary Beth and Nicholas and Diana, we are just so much richer for your conversation, your input, your deep spirituality. So thank you. Next week, I want to flag for you that we have a few more of these sessions, 2 more, and then a wrap up on the 27th. We have coming up a response, community resilience and empowerment, which is one of the goals of the Laudato Si Action platform, response to the cry of the earth the following week. And then on the 27th, 2 weeks from today, we're going to hand out some awards for folks who have done amazing work rising to the challenges of Laudato Si. So we're looking forward to having you with us to celebrate those individuals and organizations. So let's close this. Thank you again, panelists. Let's close with a prayer that many of you now know because we've been using it quite a bit, and I'm sure you use it in your own work, which is Pope Francis's A Prayer for the Earth. So let's take a moment to quiet ourselves. Let's give thanks to our presenters, to this wonderful conversation, for this amazing day, another day to do God's will, to do God's work. And we look forward to continuing this tomorrow and in the weeks and months ahead. So we pray, all powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love, that we may protect life and beauty. Fill us with peace, that we may live as brothers and sisters, harming no one. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature as we journey towards your infinite light. We thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice, love, and peace. And thank you all, and have a great evening. Mary Beth, Diana, Nicholas, thank you so much.